me start and give you a little bit of historical background. I want to put this in perspective for all of us. 70 years ago, there were some 2,000 individuals, men, women, children, who lived and worked and owned property out on the Hanford site. The U.S. was at war with Germany and Japan, and there was a very real fear on the part of the nation's scientific community that the Germans were developing an atomic weapon. As stated by Albert Einstein in a letter to President Roosevelt, August 2nd, 1939. This is a copy of that letter, and let me just say, if you go out to Logston Boulevard, they have copies of the original letter from Einstein to President Roosevelt. The 2,000 individuals at the city of White Bluffs, Hanford, and on farms across the site were given from 2 weeks to 3 months notice to move off of their homes, their farms, and their businesses. What happened next is incredible. 50,000 individuals from all over the United States and some foreign countries, some scientists and engineers, were brought together for the first time to build what had never been built before. But first, they had to build a city where they could live and work, be housed and fed. And it became the 4th largest city in the state of Washington in a matter of months. B-reactor was built in 11 months without any computers. And much of the equipment, piping, and electronics had to be fabricated on site. That amazing engineering feat is what we're celebrating here today. The start of the atomic age. 20% of this nation's power comes from nuclear power. Thousands and thousands of individuals' lives are saved every year thanks to radioisotopes, X-ray machines, CAT scans, and industrial isotopes are used all over the nation. Just this past week came the announcement that the Mars landing of Curiosity is a nuclear-powered Mars roving vehicle. If it's powered by plutonium, and we think it is, the plutonium could have come from this site. B-reactor was the nation's first full-scale nuclear plant in the world. That's why we're here today, to recognize 70 years of atomic achievement that came as a result of the Manhattan Project. I want to go slow. August 13th, 1942, the Manhattan Project started. August 14th, 1945, the war was over. 3 years and 1 day. 3 years and 1 day. The people who achieved that need to be recognized. We also need to recognize the 2,000 individuals who lived and worked out on the site and were asked to leave for this national mission. And the 50,000 people who came, including my father-in-law and many people in this room, to build something that had never been built before. That's why we're here today. Our first speaker today is Major Rodney S. Baker. He's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You may ask why the Army Corps of Engineers? Because they were the first group on the Hanford site when we moved the people off of the site. Major?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you to commemorate one of our nation's most successful efforts, the Manhattan Project during World War II, led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm here to share with you a part of the Manhattan Project story. The Corps of Engineers has always had an important role as the nation's engineer in both national defense and civil works. Our mission has evolved ever since the Corps was established in 1802. And just prior to World War II, our mission evolved once again in a very important way. While it's clear now that the Corps of Engineers was in charge of the Manhattan Project during the war, that role was not clearly defined until the beginning of the war. The Corps mission evolved into the Manhattan Project because of two key decisions made by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Those decisions were made just before and shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941. Those decisions specified Army leadership in the Manhattan Project. The head of the National Defense Research Committee in charge of atomic research at that time was Vannevar Bush. On October 9, 1941, Bush met with President Roosevelt and presented the possibility of atomic bomb construction. Roosevelt granted Bush permission to explore construction needs with the Army, but to not go beyond research and development. Later, on March 9, 1942, Bush reported to President Roosevelt that it seemed likely that an atomic bomb could be constructed. Importantly, Bush recommended that the project be turned over to the Army, and here's why. A large atomic bomb project would require management by a governmental group accustomed to managing large projects. The project and its large funding would also need to be kept secret. The construction expertise of the Corps of Engineers made it the logical choice to build atomic bomb production facilities. President Roosevelt agreed. On June 17, 1942, the atomic bomb project was officially assigned to the Army Corps of Engineers. Events unfolded quickly after that. The responsibilities for process development, materials procurement, engineering design, and site selections were assigned to the Corps of Engineers. An Army officer would be in overall command of the entire project. The Corps of Engineers established the Manhattan Engineer District on June 18, 1942. It was meant to appear to outsiders as simply another Corps of Engineers district, created in the midst of a war. Casual observers would have assumed that the Manhattan District handled Corps work only in the New York City area. In reality, the Corps of Engineers organizational structure was used to hide the development of the atomic bomb during World War II. The Corps created a unique district in the midst of a war to help camouflage a very secret effort. On September 17, 1942, Colonel Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was placed in charge of the Manhattan Project. He was promoted to Brigadier General 7 days later. Groves was an engineer with impressive credentials, including building the Pentagon. Perhaps most importantly, he had strong administrative abilities. Groves recruited the DuPont Company to be the prime contractor for the construction of the plutonium production complex. On December 16, 1942, Colonel Franklin T. Mathias of Groves' staff, plus 2 DuPont engineers, headed for the Pacific Northwest and Southern California to investigate possible production sites. After viewing 6 locations in Washington, Oregon, and California, the group agreed that the Hanford area was the best site. At Hanford, Bonneville and Grand Coulee dams offered substantial hydroelectric power. The flat but rocky terrain provided excellent support for the massive plutonium production buildings. The expansive and isolated site was far enough inland to meet security requirements. Existing transportation facilities could quickly be improved. Labor was readily available. In January 1943, General Groves visited here and established the Hanford Engineer Works, codenamed Site W, as the site of the Manhattan Project's full-scale plutonium production facility. Colonel Mathias returned to the Hanford area on February 22, 1943, to establish a temporary office. His orders were to purchase 500,000 acres in and around the Hanford, Pasco, White Bluffs area. During the summer of 1943, Hanford became the Manhattan Project's newest boomtown. The rest of the story is history, and we're here today to recognize that important history. The Corps of Engineers recognizes and thanks the many people and organizations that worked on the Manhattan Project, here at Hanford and elsewhere. We also thank those who now work to preserve this important chapter of American history. While the current Corps slogan, Building Strong, was created more recently, the Manhattan Project and Manhattan Engineer District effort 7 decades ago are excellent examples of how the Corps got the job done and done well. We remain dedicated to our mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Major. Our next speaker is Maynard Plahuta. Most of you know him as the president of the B-Reactor Museum Association, longtime friend, longtime Hanford worker.
Well, thank you, Gary. I welcome all of you here today. And as Gary said, it's the B-Reactor Museum Association, or otherwise known as Burma, so we'll use that terminology off and on. But I must say, shortly after Hanford's mission was changed to a cleanup project began to be realized by a number of people that there's really a need to organize and preserve B reactor and hopefully to be sure that it could be used and converted into a public museum. So for the first decade or so, and that was back in 1991 approximately, the first decade or so, there really wasn't a whole lot of support here locally for that mission. But fortunately, that changed. In a decade or so ago, it's moved tremendously forward, and we now have the museum out there and well on a way of a National Historic Park. But I particularly want to thank a number of the local organizations in this team, particularly TRIDEC, the Visitors Convention Bureau, the Hanford Communities, and particularly DOE, who has really stepped up and worked cooperative with all of us to see this happening in this great event we propose to have this national park. I will focus for a few seconds on some of the memories of the early workers, some details about the workforce and the living conditions back in the early construction days. People from all over the United States came to work here, as Gary had mentioned. Good pay was the key drawing card. There was also common laborers received 2 times what the rates were wherever they happened to be, and then had, in addition, plenty of overtime pay. And skilled workers were approximately 50% higher than what the prevailing rate was at most places. Nevertheless, it was difficult to get enough workers. They required a large number. And because much of the people in that age group were in the military service. Slightly more than half of all the workers were 38 years or older. And 3/4 of those between 18 and 26 had a 4F draft rating. So they were not eligible for the draft. Then another additional amounts who had deferred annuities either because they worked at other production war facilities or in the Department of Defense itself. And they were there because of the war effort and having the high priority for that project. But the secrecy was an element of highest importance. Worker turnover was relatively high. There were several reasons for this. We all heard about the termination winds and the great sandstorms that were around at that time. Other reasons included the isolation, the miserable living and housing conditions. They were not great initially. The requirement to maintain security. And though Hanford was a vital site in the war effort, most people didn't recognize that and often left because they felt they just weren't contributing much to that effort, and they didn't know what they were building. There are many interesting stories and documented oral interviews that can be told, and I'll just use a few examples. Rob Lee Johnson, and maybe some of you people here knew Rob Lee, but he's got the story that he came to work one day, and his boss says, "We've got 2 employees on the rolls." Rob Lee kind of looked at him, he says, "Yeah, we hired 650 yesterday and 648 terminated." And then there's the story, if you quit Hanford and went to work in the service or went to selective service, you were a coward. And another thing was here, there was a public forum here a couple of years ago, and the question started being asked of, well, what was it like working there, and where is it kind of dangerous, and were you afraid to work with radioactive materials? And Larry Denton, bless his heart, he passed away here a year or so ago, said, no, DuPont was really safety conscious. He says, I was never afraid to go to work. The only time I was kind of fearful, he says, if I went to the bar on Saturday night. And so, but in the early days of the construction, conditions were similar to most every other construction site. Drunkenness was the biggest problem for the Hanford Patrol. There were other things. There were gambling, there was thievery, there were bootlegging, prostitution, rapes, and even murders. But as the former worker noted, Hanford was a microcosm of society in general as far as crime was concerned. It was not really a whole lot different than if you looked at the statistics nationwide. Generally, families socialized together. Nearly all families didn't have relatives nearby or close friends that they knew previously. So they developed a real neighborly relationship and friendships, camaraderie among themselves. And many of you here probably can recognize that. Another important fact about the Hanford project was that it had a concentrated core of some of the most intelligent, brilliant technical minds. We've all heard about the tremendous achievements. Time doesn't permit us to go through all of those. But it's really necessary to remember that at Hanford during the Manhattan Project and throughout the whole Cold War period, these achievements are of tremendous national and international importance. And I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of people didn't know what they were working on or what they were doing until the drum bombed. And at that point, there was a tremendous jubilation here at the Hanford site as well as throughout the nation. Workers themselves began to recognize what they had actually contributed. And also they began to realize that the tremendous technical accomplishments and achievements were really of importance globally and to the whole world. And that should not be lost in our history. These are the factors that the Burma people primarily recognize, and including its technical and social importance of all where the work is going. And this is true of the entire Manhattan Project, not only here, but at Oak Ridge and at Los Alamos as well. The Hanford Project actually deserves and truly deserves a national park designation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maynard. Speaking on behalf of the Hanford communities is Pam Larson. Pam?
Thanks, Gary. I'm honored to participate in the program today representing the Hanford Communities. The Hanford Communities is an association of the cities of Richland, Pasco, Kennewick, Benton, and Franklin counties and the Port of Benton. It was formed 18 years ago so that local governments would have a mechanism to work together on Hanford issues. In addition to advocating for cost-effective cleanup, the Hanford communities have been strong supporters of the preservation of B reactor and the formation of the Manhattan Project National Park. Locally, you've heard about our partners that are part of the B reactor team. And we have also had the pleasure of working with the Crest Museum in organizing this event today, and with the Richland Library, who graciously donated this space to us. For the past 18 years, I've had the honor of representing the city of Richland as a board member of the Energy Communities Alliance. I've had the opportunity to get to know my local government counterparts in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. When our members of Congress directed the National Park Service to do a resource study examining the possibility of creating a Manhattan Project unit of NPS, the Energy Communities Alliance formed a coalition to work together to coordinate our input into the special resource study and to affirm that all three communities should be part of the new national park. When the draft of the study was released and only Los Alamos was recommended for inclusion, our sister cities, as well as the Department of Energy, rose up and said that that was not acceptable. The National Park Service found our message to be compelling, and when the final study was submitted to Congress last year, it recommended that all three communities be included. That recommendation could not have happened without the full support of the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy had to affirm that they would maintain ownership of all Manhattan Project facilities, and they had to agree to partner with the National Park Service if the park were ultimately to be established. Once the study was submitted to Congress by Secretary Ken Salazar, our coalition began working on draft legislation to propose to congressional committees. And I want to take an aside to tell you that Secretary Salazar actually came to our community at the invitation of Congressman Hastings and our senators and toured B reactor. And he was absolutely smitten with the facility. So I'm very fortunate to have that level of support from Interior as well as the Department of Energy. Our local group discovered that we have many strong allies in this country as well as our communities. The Atomic Heritage Foundation, based in Washington, D.C., has been a vocal proponent of the historic preservation and formation of the national park. We have also been joined by the National Park Conservation Association, which is based in Washington, D.C., and which has offices in Seattle. A group of NPCA members from Seattle traveled to Washington, D.C. to promote the creation of the park. So even the West Side understands the importance of our history. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has also joined the fold and are strong supporters. Our B reactor team last fall started participating in national conference calls with these national associations as well as the three communities to define what we hoped would be included in the legislation. We shared those thoughts with Todd Young, who is the Chief of Staff of the House Natural Resource Committee, which is chaired by our own Congressman Doc Hastings. Todd drafted an outstanding bill, which received a hearing in June. Representatives from each of the three communities were invited to testify, and Gary Petersen from Tridec represented our region. The bill has passed out of the House committee, and we're looking forward to Congressman Hastings' comments today to tell us about its progress. This April, the Hanford communities hosted a conference of the three communities here in this room. We brought together the people in each of the communities actively engaged in historic tourism. All three Visitor and Convention Bureau presidents were here, the librarians, the state historic preservation officers, representatives of historic preservation organizations such as Burma, as well as elected officials. The panel discussions from that conference will soon be available for all of you to view on the City of Richland website. In the past couple of weeks, we have seen increased national attention to the prospect of authorization of the national park. The CBS Morning Show had a segment about the legislation, and we've received editorial endorsement not only in our three communities, but from the Detroit News and today the Washington Post, which just amazes me. We are so hopeful that the legislation will pass this year, and we really thank all of you for your support and enthusiasm. Following this press conference, there's a cake and water bottles for you to take, and then also a list of activities today, things that you can do to learn more about our history. And I want to point out to you at the end of the day, after work, for those of us that are working, the Atomic Ale Brew Pub will be putting a number of their specialties on sale. So core reactor pizza, B-reactor brownies, and handcrafted ales will be available. And due to what I'm wearing today, and you see other people in the room wearing B-reactor docent shirts, I just want to point out to you, to my left here, this fantastic photograph of the B-reactor complex when it was in operation. And I've heard people wonder why we have these maps with the pins in them. This is the visitors that have come to B-reactor this year and where they came from. And this is the world map of visitors that have come from, I believe, 38 countries. So, and thanks to the Department of Energy for increasing the number of tours this year. We went from 8,000 tours last year to 10,000 this year. So that's a really great achievement. Thank you.
Next, I welcome Matt McCormick, the RL Manager, Richland Operations Office. Matt?
Well, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here today and representing Department of Energy management and staff at this event, recognizing the start of a turning point in our nation's history. As you can imagine, a job like mine with a whole lot of responsibility and a fair amount of stress, as you can see with the gray hair here, as we clean up the legacy of Hanford's work that was key to winning World War II and the Cold War. But it also comes with a tremendous amount of heritage and history of being part of something very unique and special. As a manager, you really are part of a fairly small club, a clutch of people over the years that have had the same front row seats that I have. Their pictures actually hang up on the wall leading to my office in the federal building, 13 of them to be exact, from Colonel Matthias, the first one who started it all in 1943, through the end of the Manhattan Project and into Hanford's lead role as a production site during the Cold War. And then, of course, into the all-important cleanup and remediation era that we are in today. So just 14 of us in the last 70 years. What we did is we asked for their perspective on this anniversary, and I'll share some thoughts with you this morning. First, I'd like to recognize RL Manager Keith Klein. I think he's in the room here. Where are you, Keith? There he is, right there, standing up. So thanks for joining us today. Also, former manager Dave Brockman, the big guy, he is on his way from the airport and will be joining us here a little bit later. And also, Manager Mike Lawrence, who couldn't be here with us today, but did send his thoughts, which I'd like to share with you now. And so Mike said here, it was a great honor to serve as the manager of the Hanford site from 1984 to 1990. This was the last time that Hanford served as a nuclear material production site, completing a mission dating back to its origins as in the Manhattan Project, which we're celebrating today. I congratulate Congressman Hastings and his colleagues for their leadership in establishing a Manhattan Project National Park recognizing Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos. It was a privilege to work with the men and women at Hanford. Their knowledge, skills, and dedication overcame tremendous technical obstacles to end World War II and defer further global conflict. Whenever challenging missions of great national importance are called for today, the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project are used as standards to demonstrate a great accomplishment that the USA can achieve. We should all feel proud of that legacy. And then Keith Klein, he was the manager from 1999 to 2007, 8 years, wrote that working with the Manhattan Project veterans as an AEC intern fresh out of college in the 1970s. So when you say 1970s, that's early 1970s, not the later part. And and he had a chance to discuss with the folks that actually worked in the Manhattan engineering, the engineers, the scientists, which would have been great. And he found that it was hard to fathom how much was learned, applied, and done in so little time. He goes on to say, my 4 years at Rocky Flats and then 8 years here as the RL manager, working and walking in the very same buildings that changed the course of history only heightened my sense of awe and respect for the men and women involved in those early days. Not just for what they physically accomplished in such a short time, but for the lessons they can teach us about ourselves as a people and the incredible forces at our disposal. That is why recognizing the Manhattan Project is so important, and both an inspiration and a warning. We are increasingly capable of using science, technology, and our blood, sweat, and tears for the good or bad. Just as we can destroy ourselves with these forces, so can we too harness them for the good of mankind. With the right motivation and leadership, we are capable of doing amazing things. And then lastly, Dave Brockman, who, like I said, is on his way, was really instrumental in accelerating B-reactor preservation effort after seeing it declared as a National Historic Landmark in 2008. He has to say that the Hanford site amazing story needs to be celebrated and told through events like this and through the preservation of historic facilities such as B-reactor. I look forward to the day the people of this great country can drive up to B-reactor and then learn firsthand about the sacrifices and the achievements that together make up one of the most incredible stories our nation has ever known. I have no doubt that with the passion of the people gathered here, that day cannot be far off. So as we look to the future and a time when each of the original Manhattan Project sites will be part of a new Manhattan National Historic Park, I see many positive outcomes for this area. It is critical that these stories of innovation, patriotism, sacrifice, and science, and the many more encompassed by Hanford's vast lands and facilities are told for this and future generations to come. I am very proud of DOE's work with the National Park Service to ensure that all three of the original Manhattan Project sites made it into the final National Park Service recommendation to the Secretary of Interior, and now the legislation proposed by both the House and the Senate. We will work just as hard once the park is a reality to ensure a smooth transition and a hugely successful national park at the Hanford site that honors the tens of thousands of women whose contributions we honor here today. So thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce, my great pleasure, to introduce Doc Hastings, our congressman, and the man who has put forth the legislation in the House for a Manhattan Project National Park. Doc.
thank you, Gary, and it certainly is a pleasure to be here to commemorate this day, because 70 years ago, when the Manhattan Project was established, it not only changed the face of our community here, but if you really delve down, it changed the face of the world. That's how significant the Manhattan Project was. And so as we are meeting here, and I understand there are similar meetings going on in Oak Ridge and in Los Alamos, what we're really saying indirectly is recognizing those individuals that were part of this, that Gary talked about, that Maynard talked about. It is really significant. And what I think what I have learned in going through this process is that because of these three sites, and all of them were relatively isolated when they were developed, meaning that there wasn't a whole lot of population around who supported it, the significance of what they did, I think, is just is absolutely incredible. And I do want to congratulate all of you that were involved in keeping this hope alive. Because without your involvement and your prodding, not only here, but at the other sites, we wouldn't be where we are today. Now, as has been mentioned, the committee that I have the privilege to chair has passed the bill out of committee by unanimous vote. And I have every indication that hopefully that will pass before the end of the year, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But let me talk about the B reactor. The B reactor has long been recognized as a pretty significant facility, going back to 1968 when it was declared a civil engineering landmark. And then it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1992. And of course, in 2008, as was mentioned, it was designated as a National Historic Site. And so with that legislation, or with the B reactor as kind of the main focal point, because of what it contributed to all of this, you know, that is really where we are. And I want to mention, Pam had mentioned this earlier, that Secretary Salazar was out here. I was with him that day when we flew in, went out to the B reactor, and for those of you that have been out there, to sit in that chair, one can only think of the thoughts that are going through their mind when, you know, the button was pressed. And so the Secretary was sitting there, and after, you know, was told the story, I asked somebody, it might have been you, Matt, I don't recall, I said, show him the computer. And he turned around and grabbed a slide rule. Now, and when you think about that, and especially when that technology had not been perfected, but we were in a war, and we had to win the war, and that showed the American ingenuity. When the first study came out, as Pam had mentioned, Hanford and Oak Ridge were not part of that. But I really want to congratulate especially Dave Brockman and Matt, because the technical difficulties on that the National Park had, I think they're legitimate. I mean, after all, they don't deal every day with radioactive materials. So there had to be some way to bridge that gap. But Dave really took the lead, and Matt has followed up on that. And Inez Tria, by the way, before she left as EM manager, was very much involved back in D.C. So that's, you know, the story is there. It needs to be told. The mere fact that every time the department wants to have or sends out a request to tour the B reactor, and it gets filled up in a very, very short order, tells you that there's a lot of interest in this. And now that younger school children are being allowed to go out there, that should be part of that educational process. So where are we now then? Well, the legislation, as I mentioned, has passed out of the House Resources Committee. It passed out unanimously. Our biggest challenge is going to simply be time on the floor in order to get that passed. But there is companion legislation in the Senate. Now, there are some technical difficulties that we have to work out. We try to work those out as much as we possibly could before the legislation was introduced. Senator Bingaman from New Mexico, obviously Los Alamos, he's in his last term. He wants to get this passed. He's dedicated to doing so. So I have every expectation that before this Congress adjourns, we will pass this legislation with strong bipartisan support. And lastly, part of the legislation that we have will designate Hanford within 1 year, as you know. And during the hearing on that, there has to be agreement between Interior and Energy for that agreement. And after the hearing, both of them, by the way, on both sides were enthusiastic. We can get this done, no problem. So in the question period, I asked them, I said, now, you have 1 year to get this done. Do you have high expectations that it can get done in 1 year? And they both said yes. And I said, I would certainly hope so, because it took 11 months to build a B reactor. Certainly we can get an agreement between this from a bureaucratic standpoint. So thank you very much, and I look forward, I too, Gary, look forward to viewing the whole site there, the whole site from the top of Rattlesnake Mountain sometime too.